Are you a founder raising funds? An investor just getting started? Welcome to the Capital Maze, a podcast designed to cut through the noise and even the playing field between founders and funders. The Capital Maze, helping you navigate fundraising with confidence.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think in this capitally constrained market, which founders keep hearing that term, it's really important for founders to be able to interview and ask questions to their funders and to VC firms to really understand what the magic is going on behind the scenes and how we can put our best foot forward. So I think these conversations between you and I are really important and going to help a lot of people hopefully get funded. So thank you for taking the time. If you wouldn't mind just giving a brief intro about yourself, and we can hop into all things investing.
Hi, Sarah. How are you? And if it's a little choppy, I apologize to your audience. I'm having internet issues at home today. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm honored to be here. So I'm Alex Chompff, and as I probably mentioned once or twice before, I'm a married man with 5 kids. That's my most important job. I live out here in California where I grew up. And over the years, I've had the good opportunity to be in and out of the startup industry, the technology industry, the venture capital and finance industry. And I am both an angel investor and a venture capital investor. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I mean, I think your work speaks for itself. Coming out of Evolution VC and now having Minerva Fund, I just appreciate that you have a really focal point or emphasis on underrepresented founders and women founders as well. And yeah, just appreciate that your work kind of speaks for itself, but want to know more about your work and also what exactly it means to be a venture capitalist. So I think that's where a lot of people coming into tech get a little bit confused, especially if they have an awesome idea, but where do they go for funding? There's angels, there's family offices, there's accelerators, there's VCs, and a lot of people take a lot of pride in being a venture-backed startup. And what exactly does that mean? So can you explain what being venture-backed means and exactly where those dollars are coming from that would be invested into a startup?
Yeah, you bet. So, first of all, venture capital is a subsection of a larger set of markets that deal in what are called non-public equities, or you could say private ownership of corporations. And venture capital is especially interested in owning very young corporations, very new corporations, corporations that have not really reached public attention yet, but instead are, diamonds in the rough, or maybe undiscovered gems is a better way to look at it. That would be kind of what venture capital firms are looking for. And venture capital fund managers, general partners like myself, are entrusted with the care of investor money. And our investors can come from a wide variety of places. They can be institutions, they can be pension funds, they can be what are known as family offices, they can be what are called high net worth individuals. There are a lot of sources for capital because there's a lot of capital that's looking to invest in the earliest stages of company formation. So that's really the business of venture capital. It's bringing this, what we call dry powder, to work in terms of funding startup companies. And, to be clear, startup encompasses a fairly wide range of commercial activity. You're still considered to be a pretty young company if you're worth, $50 million or less. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Evolution, we operate on the earliest segment, typically of the, let's call it 0 to 50 or even 0 to $5 million invested amount. So we're very often the first investors in or the second investors in. It's not unusual for us to be the first institutional investors, which, as you note, can be can be something that gives other investors confidence and gives the founding team confidence about the validity of their idea. Now, typically, early stage investing kind of works along a continuum. And you mentioned some other things like angels or accelerators. So let's just take a minute and unpack that for your audience. So, very usually, when you start a business, and let's be clear, by the way, that over 90% of the businesses that are going to start in the United States this year will never go after professional investment. They're just not appropriate for professional investment or venture capital investment. What that they'll use other methods to finance their growth. But for those that are going to be looking to the private capital markets to finance them, there's usually a series of events that a company will go through. First, the founders will bootstrap the business. They'll put in their own money. And sometimes it can be a little bit of money. It can be a few hundred or a few $1,000s. And sometimes, depending on the founder, it can be quite substantial. I know founders who have invested $1 million. So from there, typically your next round of funding will come from your friends and your family. These are people that know you personally. And while they may or may not be an expert in your field or your product, they probably don't have a lot of investments of this type. This is not something that they're typically buying into. This is a situation where they're probably supporting you as a person. And friends and family investments can vary pretty widely, but a typical range that you'll see here is anywhere between a few $1,000s and a few $100,000. And, that's really important money. And it's important for so many reasons, because when you take money from your friends and family, you have to recognize, and they have to recognize, that the odds are that your business will not actually succeed. No matter how strongly we believe in you and you believe in yourself, the odds are simply not on your side. And so that can be a very serious moment. And then coming right after friends and family, typically you get into what are called angel investors. And angel investors are people who may know you or they may know of you through a friend, but they're actually investing in startups on a more regular basis. It's something that they do. And the thing that distinguishes an angel investor is that they are investing their own money. That's what makes an angel investor an angel investor. It's their own money that they're investing. And from there, you go to venture capital typically. And venture capital will be someone like myself and my general partners. And we'll be operating under contracts and guidelines and regulations and participating in the private equity markets in the section of venture capital by redeploying other investors' capital into this economy.
So you said something about a friends and family round, and we hear that a lot. So I'm in the Midwest. I grew up in Chicago, and for a lot of founders that I know in the Midwest and in the South, friends and family rounds are tricky. A lot of my family comes from the South side of Chicago. Most of them were Chicago public school teachers, and not saying you can't make, a really fantastic living, but it's kind of constrained on what we can do, friends and family, especially coming from like an underrepresented founder type market. So for those who are raising, who might not have access to friends and family capital, what would your avenue for those founders be? Would you say there are certain groups you would recommend joining, or certain angel groups to look at who could kind of front that for them? Because I know for us, that's why we went through Techstars. We were so appreciative of the Techstars Accelerator, because it was kind of that first money in replacement of that friends and family round, because we didn't have that pool to go through. But obviously, as first-time founders, you don't want to do accelerator after accelerator after accelerator if you're kind of in that idea or first going to market phase. So what would your ideal avenue for that founder look like who might not have those friends and family to go to get to that angel or initial investment phase?
That's a really good question. And I'll start by admitting that my view of the world is, narrow. I can only see what I can see through my glasses, and they go with me everywhere, and they're hardly everywhere. So, I have a very limited view naturally. At the same time, let's pause for a moment and let's talk about this idea of fundraising, because fundraising is pretty much a full-time job, and it can be really distracting from your business, and it can create a lot of entanglements that can burden a business early on. And fundraising is often seen as an inherently meritorious activity. But in point of fact, I don't think fundraising is inherently meritorious. I think fundraising is a necessary evil in some cases. I think what's much more meritorious is having your customers fund your growth, having your community fund your growth, because your customers in your community are interested in the product or service that you're bringing to market, and they want to give you their money as a sign of their value in terms of what it is that you're providing them. And if you can build your company with customer dollars rather than with investor dollars, you will be a lot happier and a lot better off. Okay, so just let me start there, because there's this kind of natural rush to where am I going to raise funds? And the best place you can ever raise funds from is your customers. Now, that being said, you did mention some other avenues that are out there. And, especially in the United States, there's pretty broad awareness of the importance of the entrepreneurial sector of our economy. And so most cities, even most towns, have probably got some kind of group that's looking out for the welfare of the startups in their community or the entrepreneurs in their community. If you live in a particularly, a particularly rural area, you might have to migrate a little bit in time toward the nearest concentration of population. But this is where Zoom is super handy, right? You can attend all kinds of meetings all around the country without ever leaving your desk. And I don't think there's any better way to spark interest in your project and to elicit opportunities for funding than to share your project, to share your vision, to help people to understand what it is that is animating you as a CEO, as a founder, as a founding team. What is it that you are creating and bringing to the world, and why does it matter? And telling that story in as many venues as possible and as broadly as possible, I think is probably anybody's best route to that early stage funding. Now, do be cautious and don't take funding from just anyone. I like to equate funding to a wedding, which is to say that when you've never been married before, as some of your audience will know from being married, when you're first getting married, you're very focused on the wedding. You're thinking about the flowers and the cake and the guests and all these things. It's very, very important to you to get those things right. And what you learn is that the wedding is in the rear view mirror pretty quickly, and now you have a marriage. So I would encourage you to think about your investors in that vein, because the money that they put into your company, no matter how much money they put in, it will be in the rear view mirror relatively soon. And then you'll have a lifetime relationship with them. And you should really ask yourself if you want to be in a lifetime relationship with them. So be very discriminating about who you allow onto your, what we call the cap table, the capitalization table, who you allow to invest in your company. But by all means, get out there and share the story. And if your friends and family are not in the position to invest in your company, you're probably pretty close to or inside of a community filled with people that are interested.
And so when you first started talking, you mentioned if you can focus on customer dollars, that's really important. And I think that's the hope and dream of every entrepreneur is, to not have to give up a piece of their company to accelerate things and to go off of the revenue to build their company. But when you're in that ideation phase, especially with the introduction of AI and, the usage of that and the usage of machine learning as we kind of scale and grow, just as a venture atmosphere and an entrepreneur ecosystem, if you will. There's a lot of money that needs to go behind that. And almost every company that comes to market now has this kind of huge engineering lift that's needed. And we see it time and time again on LinkedIn that if you could just get, a CEO and a CTO who can build and work off of, their own dollars or do it for free, that's kind of the best equation. But for someone who doesn't have access to that, if there's just a great CEO out there who has this idea, they need to find a dev shop to be able to build it. They don't have the ecosystem to find a co-founder. Is that someone you would invest in? If you say, hey, you have a great idea, we'll help you put the pieces together in order to kind of get to that customer revenue because your idea is validated through a wait list or something like that. Like, what are the pieces of the puzzle that you would look at as a VC to say, even though this person is just an idea right now, I would still invest in them? Or what would you say should be their kind of go-to in order to get to that point they could get customer funded?
Yeah, good question. So there was a lot in there.
Yeah.
I think one of your questions is like, how do we decide? How do we pick? How do we, when in the end we are finally going to go ahead and write the check? What are those characteristics that we're looking for? And those characteristics, because we are very early stage investors, are very often most closely related to the CEO and the founding team, who they are, what their background is. And really what we're asking ourselves at Evolution is this opportunity credible? Is this a credible opportunity? Because if it's not a credible opportunity, then we need to pass on it as quickly as possible for the benefit of the entrepreneur that we're talking to, so that they're not waiting for us, and for our investors who are employing us to put their capital to work in credible ideas. So immediately we test for credibility, and there we break credibility down into a few different things. One of the things that we look for is a team that's well balanced. So sometimes you meet that individual CEO who's going to do it all themselves. Well, that's probably not going to be our first choice. Our first choice is going to be for a founding team of anywhere from 3 to 4 members. And there are some specific roles that we're looking to have filled. And it's our experience that the same person does not fill multiple roles. The first role that we're looking for is the product owner, the individual who has the passion for the product. The CEO, or it doesn't have to be a CTO, CEO could be the CTO, but one of those founders that absolutely positively is not going to be able to go to sleep tonight if they don't advance their idea somehow. Okay, we want somebody who's dedicated to the product and creating that great experience. The next thing that we're looking for is somebody who absolutely positively has to shake 100 hands today. Absolutely positively talks to every person in the line at the grocery store, who has friends all over town, because what they're really motivated by is learning about people and finding out what people need and people want. And then they're this kind of person, we call this a market person. This kind of market person is committed to finding what their community needs. And so they're the ones who are going to bring your customers together and elicit what your customers need and bring that information back to the product person that's going to actually work on the product. Because typically product people are not great at working the market, and market people are not usually great at creating products. So we're looking for 2 different kinds of people. Then the third person that we're looking for is somebody who really likes to keep track of all of the documents and all of the dollars, right? Somebody who's really interested in making sure that all the bills get paid, all the papers get filed, all the forms get out. And that's its own kind of personality. Usually that kind of person is not super interested in shaking 100 hands and may or may not be interested in building the perfect product. Just as the person who builds the perfect product doesn't always want to count all the dollars. So that really that well-balanced team. And we borrow that from Ernesto Ciroli's Trinity of Management. And for those of your listeners who may not be familiar with Ernesto, I highly recommend him to you. He's a dear friend and a genius, and the creator of the Trinity of Management and Enterprise Facilitation. And his work is credited with having created certainly thousands, I think perhaps tens of thousands of enterprises around the world on almost every continent. He is a very, very smart fellow. So product, market, finance. Then if we're, going into an industry that is very competitive or highly regulated or capital intensive, then we're looking for one more person that our friend Steve Hoffman, Captain Hoff of Founderspace, calls the hotshot. Because you need somebody who's going to be able to pick up the phone or send the email and get an answer, get a look back. Because crowded industries are crowded and regulated industries are regulated. And you need somebody who knows how to navigate those waters. Now, not every startup is dealing with regulated, crowded stuff. But for those that are, we're looking for that hotshot. So for us, it starts with the team. It doesn't quite end with the team, but the team is indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
We really can't do without it. From there, if we're talking about technology, like you mentioned, we certainly like to see the technology person on the team be compensated with equity rather than with money. So it's okay to use developers early on and pay them and so forth and do what you have to do to get to where you need to be. But ultimately, we find that the most successful companies, at least in the technology space, and we're not exclusive to technology, but we want somebody on the team that's compensated with equity, that understands how to build and instrument what it is that we're working on or they're working on.
So let me ask you this, because I actually was on a call last week with a VC firm, and they did these kind of office hours. And so it was kind of like a quick pitch with a couple of other companies for about an hour-long session. And one of the main questions that they asked people when they say, oh, I have one or two other co-founders or two or three other co-founders that aren't on the call today, the first question that was asked was, what is the equity split? And so as a VC, when people are forming their companies and they're coming to you, what would you want that split to look like? Is there anything that would be a red flag to you of equity split, whether it's co-founder, fractional? Like, what would you want to see on paper that would make you go, okay, that's fair? And what would you see that would make you go, okay, nope, they have no idea what they're doing. This equity split makes zero sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my thinking about that over the years has definitely matured. In the beginning, I was pretty egalitarian about it. I liked a third between the three founders. However, as life went on, and I learned more, I keep coming back to the inescapable fact that the CEO stays up at night. The CEO stays up at night. The CEO has responsibilities that are profound. And I recognize that, let's say, the CFO, while they may have responsibilities, they're probably somewhat less profound, right? And so I like to see the equity stakes reflect the profundity of your contribution. Okay. I don't like to see big imbalances. That goes back to motivation and incentive, and also a topic that I spend a fair amount of time on, which goes into the heading of ethical capitalism. And I think capitalism works best when it's broadly distributed. I think the ownership culture benefits from equitable ownership, but I no longer subscribe to an idea that I once had around split it equally between the founders, because I think that the level of contribution and commitment varies by role, and it's important to recognize that. So I'm looking for maturity and thoughtfulness. I'm looking for consideration. I'm looking for a, a clear indicator that these founders have thought through what it is they're actually expecting from one another, and they've been clear with one another, and it's articulated through something like the equity split. And then let's not forget that founders leave. Lives happen. Things come along. People marry, they get divorced, they move to another town. Things happen. So it's very important, I think, to see equity vesting over an appropriate period and a method for recovering equity and transferring equity in ways that are appropriate and fair to all the parties involved.
And that's something that we went through. My initial co-founder had to step away due to family reasons and was very gracious in that. But we hear a lot of kind of horror stories when that can happen with others. And so I think that's really important to note that a vesting schedule and speaking to your legal team on that is really important just to protect yourself at the early stages. Another thing that comes up outside of an equity split that I see a battle on LinkedIn of is how much to pay yourself as an early stage founder. So if you are raising, a 500 to million pre-seed or a 3 to 5 million seed round, what is an appropriate salary for the founders to pay themselves? We see that battle happen quite a bit on LinkedIn and in Slack channels. So from your perspective, do you ask those kinds of questions when people are going through your due diligence process of what are you going to spend this money on? How much is everyone getting paid? And is there any red flag there of like you are misusing the funds if you're paying yourself X dollar amount?
Yeah, that's a very intelligent question. Like a lot of answers, I'm going to have to come back to that old wisdom, which is that there are many routes to the top of the mountain, right? So there are some things that I think you can generally look for and that most investors would agree on. And the first one is the prudential use of money, right? So we're not looking to invest in people who are going to throw it in handfuls out the window, right? And it's very easy, by the way, very, very easy when you get some money from a VC firm or any other kind of investor for that matter. You get a few $1,000,000 and you can feel wealthy. You can feel rich. And I think I would caution against that. I would keep in mind always that as the board and officers of a company that has investors, you are stewards of those funds. They're not your funds to dispense with, in any way that you see fit. Now, I will say that venture capital has changed a little bit over the years. So I got my first exposure to venture capital in the late 1990s. And at that time, venture capital was principally about infrastructure costs, at least in the technology field. So if you wanted to have servers that could do file and print and connect to the internet and work in a modern way in the late 1990s, you needed very expensive equipment. And so a lot of venture capital went to that kind of infrastructure, to that kind of equipment. And because the monies involved were very substantial, and because being an entrepreneur is a better second or third profession, or a second or third career than it is a first career, you tended to have entrepreneurs who were a little bit older, who were in their 40s or 50s, who had kids, who were part of their community, who had responsibilities. And I think that the general answer that you would have heard back in the day then, and that you'll still hear today from prudent investors, is take what you need to. Pay yourself what you must. pay yourself what is required so that you can concentrate fully on the problem at hand, which is figuring out how to launch a business from an idea to, an exit, customers, revenue, all the things that are, that a business entails. What I think every investor wants from their entrepreneur is focus. And so one of the purposes of our investment is to help you be able to concentrate on what you're doing. So I wouldn't say pay yourself so little that you're worried about your utility bills and your food and your rent. That, get yourself to the point where you can concentrate. Then I would say stop before you are treating yourself to the things that you might come to feel you deserve for your hard work. When you treat yourself with the revenue that you've generated, not with your investors' money, right? So I would say now with that understanding, what your needs are can vary a great deal. Are you in your 20s? Are you living in a dorm room with 4 other people, right? Are you in your 40s with 3 kids? Are you trying to put a kid through college? Do you have a spouse that works? Do you live in an expensive part of the country? Right? There are a lot of factors that I think a thoughtful dialogue can uncover. And I wouldn't go with blanket answers like X amount or, such and such a salary. I'd say, pay yourself what is necessary to concentrate and focus on doing a great job, and stop before you reach luxury or treating yourself. Treat yourself with your customers' money, not your investors' money.
I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people because, it's the question of how did you come up with those salaries, or how did you come up with that valuation? Like, there's so much that goes into it. And I think geographical location is a really big factor with how just expensive it is in terms to live in an apartment or a house right now. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's good to keep. I really like that, to pay yourself for what you need, but not treat yourself. I think that's a really good way to go about it. And you said something a little bit earlier that I wanted to dig into as well, that kind of goes along the salary route or kind of boss route. And you said that you have people that you are responding to who are giving you the money, kind of like your, bosses or the people at hand who are trusting you with the money to invest in a startup. So how do VCs pay themselves? And who exactly are you answering to at the end of the day? Like, founders have to answer to a board once they have one, they have to answer to their investors, they have to answer to their customers. Who do the VCs have to answer to, and how are they getting paid?
Yeah, very intelligent question. So here I'm going to speak about classic, and I'm going to use air quotes, venture capital. Okay. Because venture capital, even though it's a relatively young industry, it's probably only, let's say, between 50 and 70 years old. It's probably only in its 4th or 5th generation of leaders today. Okay. So it's relatively young when you compare it to, say, the car industry or many other industries. Okay. Nonetheless, it has some pretty established ways of doing business. And the standard way of doing business, the most common way of doing business that you're going to see in this world, is you're going to see a partnership formed. And the partnership will have general partners and limited partners. And the limited partners are putting up the money, and the general partners are running the fund, making the decision, investing, curating, etc. Okay. And general partners, it's easy, by the way, to think that when you're talking to the general partner of a VC fund, you're talking to a very wealthy individual. Oftentimes, it's not the case. They're usually reasonably successful individuals because they're being entrusted with funds, and they've demonstrated over their lives that they're capable of doing that. But generally speaking, they're getting paid a salary. And that salary arises from what are called management fees. And the traditional management fee is 2% per year of the funds under management. So if you have $100 million fund, then you're collecting $2 million a year to manage that fund. That's typically what you'll see. Okay. And then those dollars are being used to keep the doors open, to hire the analysts, to pay for the technology, to, market, because a venture capital firm is just like any other business firm. It has to market. And it has to attract, what's a VC firm? It's a two-sided marketplace. We have to attract investors and we have to attract great companies. Great companies attract great investors. Great investors attract great companies. You got to do both things. That's our business. Okay, that's what we're doing. And so we're first and foremost being paid a management fee on the funds under management or assets under management. That's the usual starting point. Then as our investments come to fruition over a period of time, after our investors are paid back the money that they put in, we participate in a kind of profit sharing. And that profit sharing is called carried interest. It goes by the term carried interest. It's kind of profit sharing that reflects the years of work, because in a normal venture capital portfolio, if you made all your investments in year one, you wouldn't typically start to see investments pay out until years 5 to 7. If you were lucky, you might see something in year 4, and it's not at all unusual to have it occur many years later than 7 years. Okay, so there's a very long period of illiquidity in these kinds of investments. And so for in order for VCs to do their work, which starts with writing a check, but is very much in helping to build the value after the check is written. It's very, very important to understand that VCs don't just write checks. VCs have to get in, get involved, and help in some way. That's part of what makes them a venture capital firm. It's part of what entitles them to the regulatory treatment that they have, is their contributory effect to the companies that they're working with. And different companies will have different offerings to make to their portfolio companies, of course, right? Just like any other business, we're differentiated in what we offer. So management fees and carried interest or profit sharing. That's typically how a VC gets paid. Now, a VC will usually have to put in their own money to the fund. So they have to put up a percentage of the capital being under management will be the VC's capital, personal capital, the partner's capital. That's the typical requirement. And, particularly for early or emerging managers, it's not unusual to, need to finance yourself out of your own personal wealth or, another job or something similar. Right? Because remember, GPs are typically working, LPs are writing checks and, we're just kind of making fun here. They're writing a check and sitting back, right? A GP is writing a check and leaning in.
Okay. So theoretically, can anyone walking the streets today become a VC? Can they go and raise money from anyone? Like if, can they do a friends and family round and say, hey, I want to be a VC, and like a founder go to a bunch of people in their network and say, I'm a VC now. I'm going to focus on climate energy or whatever it might be. Here's my VC fund. Here's my fund. And now I'm off to the races. Like, can anyone do that like a founder? I mean, obviously not everyone can be a founder. There's a lot of people who try. We know the success rate for startups, right? But is it a similar journey where anyone can just decide, I'm going to be a VC, I'm going to go fund it and start investing that money?
Yeah. Hold on. I'm going to answer that question for you in 1 second. We're running a little long, so I'm just going to send a note real quick. Okay. So your question is can anyone start a venture capital fund?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes and no. Okay. It's not something that you have to come from a particular university or come from a particular bloodline or be born in a particular state or anything like that. It's a venture capital firm is a partnership, and a partnership can be created amongst willing partners. There are, however, some stipulations that federal and state governments introduce to the process. And those stipulations are typically to protect investors from situations that are unhealthy. Okay, so one of the stipulations that's typically involved is that you need to be an accredited investor as defined by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so in the United States, that usually means you have to have income of a certain level for a certain number of years, or you have to have assets of a certain level that don't include your home. And then that will allow you to identify as an accredited investor. And as an accredited investor, you can then invest into a venture capital fund. Most venture capital funds are not going to accept funds from non-accredited investors for the simple reason that regulations stipulate otherwise.
Okay.
States often impose their own controls in addition to federal controls. And there are also organizational bodies like FINRA that come together in a self-organizing way to try to make sure that people who are offering products like this to the public are, being managed with an offensive of safety, given that the entire class of activity is very risky. Right. So there's only so much safety you can put into an investment class that has a tendency to go to zero. Right. But the general idea is to keep unscrupulous actors from preying upon, the unwary. And so the answer is yes, with the proper resources and with the proper support. And certainly you would have a legal firm, and you would have an accounting firm, you'd have some other resources that you would bring to the table. You can form a venture capital firm, yes. And if you have a certain level of assets or income, then you can invest in a venture capital firm. And those are pretty much the barriers to entry. There are some softer barriers to entry, like it's harder than most people would think to sift through a large number of startup companies efficiently to find the ones that you're going to invest in. It's a fairly arduous process from a legal perspective and from an accounting perspective and from a tax perspective to keep track of your investments and how they're performing for your partnership. But those are all things that can be overcome with sufficient resources.
Okay. And that leads me, so we'll end on this question. I know you are extremely busy, but when it comes to how you sift to get to the startups that you meet with, there are plenty of VCs who have an application button on their website and receive hundreds of thousands of startups a day to sift through. But there's also, associates who will go on different websites or LinkedIn and look for people who are what we call, building in public, right? Posting about the startup, posting about your traction, having a company page, being visible to be found. One thing that I've heard from a lot of founders is the frustration of the initial associate meeting, of not knowing what the criteria is moving forward, not getting the second meeting, and this kind of notion that potentially VC firms are utilizing these associates to just gather metrics on different industries that they may want to invest in. So it may not even be because they want to invest in you. They're kind of just doing due diligence on different industries that they're interested in themselves. Do you have any indication on the best way to get in front of a VC or to understand what that decision-making process looks like? And have you seen that kind of out in the wild where maybe these associate meetings are a little bit misleading for founders?
Yeah, good question. Important topic. And I think it's important because it gets to the most inflexible of resources, right? The most inelastic of resources, according to Peter Drucker, is time. right? Time passes equally for every person on earth. The president of the United States gets exactly as much time today as I get and as you get. And that means that all of our time is very, very valuable. And it's important not to waste each other's time. And I think that the number one cure is communication, frank and honest communication. Now, there are some questions that you can ask as a founder when you're sitting across from an associate or a principal or even a partner in a fund that people will be happy to answer for you, that will give you some indication of where that fund is in its life cycle. And one of those questions is, are you actively investing? Are you currently investing? And then there are variations on that question. How much do you typically invest? How frequently do you typically invest? What kinds of companies have you been investing in? What kinds of companies are you looking to invest in? I think that a lot of entrepreneurs miss the opportunity to query the process.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember this is one of the, I say it so often that I'm afraid of repeating it too much, but I think it's really true. And I like the illustration. When you're looking for money as an entrepreneur, when you're trying to raise funding, you can feel like you're panning for gold in a freezing cold stream. And that can be very, very discouraging, right? Finding a fleck of gold. And, I've been working all day, and was that really worth it? And my hands are cold and my feet are cold. And what you don't realize is that you, the entrepreneur, you, the founder, you're the gold that all the rest of us are panning for. You're the actual valuable commodity here. This entire ecosystem exists in order to find and elevate your work. So you might have more agency and control in the process than you think you do, because you're the valuable part of the process. You're the unique bit. The VC firm isn't the unique bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would encourage every entrepreneur in your circle to engage in, a curious and respectful dialogue about the process and about expectations. And the venture capital world is actually quite large. And because it's quite large, it exists on a continuum. And some venture capital firms are going to have great customer service, and some venture capital firms are going to have not great customer service. And just like in the real world today, some companies you have to know where they are to find them, because they're well hidden secrets. And some companies are on every street corner and anybody can walk in. Well, venture capital is on that same kind of continuum, right? So don't feel as though the experience you had at one burger joint reflects every other burger joint in the world. And now that we're talking about it, maybe you're in the mood for tacos, or you're in the mood for pasta, or you're in the mood for poke, because there's a whole world of financing options out here. And they're really there to take care of you as the entrepreneur.
Yeah. I think that's a really profound and good note to end on, is that for founders, there is a lot out there, and it may not seem like that when you first get started, especially because I think with all the algorithms we have today on social media and LinkedIn and all these things, you're kind of seeing the same thing over and over again. So I would definitely recommend to founders listening to branch out and just, use Google, use AI to look and see if there's other VC firms or family offices or anyone who kind of meets the criteria of your fundraise, and know that, what you're building is important. So I think that's a really good note to end on. Is there anything else you would want to say to the founders or funders listening before we wrap up this session?
I would encourage every founder or funder in your circle, whether you're doing it today or you might do it in the future. I would encourage you to really think deeply about the kind of company that you want to send into the world where your children will be. And design your companies and support the companies that are designed in such a way as to advance the human condition. That would be my wish if I could buy everybody a Pepsi.
I love that. Well, again, thank you for joining us today. I think a lot of people are going to learn from you and what you have to say. I know in a couple episodes, we'll be interviewing other people from the Minerva and Evolution Fund as well, just to get kind of more of a founder's take. So we're excited for that. But again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will catch you next time.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to The Capital Maze. Follow us on socials and YouTube at The Capital Maze to stay in touch and submit questions you want the answers to.